Time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, quite a few people were surprised that CNN pushed out a news story last weekend, which suggested that Vice President Harris is struggling in her new role, and that her staff were pretty much at odds at times with President Biden's top advisors. This comes at a time when there is building speculation that Joe Biden will not be seeking a second term in 2024 when he turns 82 years old. So it's hard to think of anyone who knows more about POTUS and VP office relations than Craig Fuller. So I'm really curious about your take on this, and if Democrats should worry about a Biden-Harris disconnect so early in this first term of theirs.
Well, it's a fascinating topic. There's a lot to unpack there. I'll start, and there's different elements to it. First of all, in a spy exclusive behind me as a backdrop is actually the residence of the vice president, circa 1981, when the Bushes were there at the Naval Observatory. I think it's worth noting a vice president actually gets a residence. They also, of course, are protectees of the Secret Service, so they have a full Secret Service contingent and armored vehicle. Not known to some, but because they're the president of the Senate, they have a whole office in the Capitol, just off the Senate floor, which is a beautiful office, and a staff there. Also, kind of inexplicably, because they're a member of the Senate as the president, they get a, quote, state office or district office. So unlike a president, a vice president actually has offices and staff back in their state of their residence, in this case, California. It's a position that is hard sought every time you go through a presidential election. And yet it is, in my view, one of the most difficult public offices to hold and hold successfully, because by its very nature, you have to sublimate all of your passion for issues and policy and the things you would say if you were in fact a leader. You have to hold back because you're number two. And most people, George Herbert Walker Bush included, and certainly the current Vice President Harris, they ran for office. They campaigned on the issues they felt strongly about. They served in public office where they were the leader of the office. And it's just not in their nature to be number two. George Bush, I think, from the very beginning, almost studied the position and what worked and what was successful. He had spoken to Nelson Rockefeller, who'd been Ford's vice president, and Rockefeller told him that one of the biggest mistakes Rockefeller made was to accept responsibility for developing some kind of an energy policy, and he threw himself into it, and he got the best experts, and he came forth with a policy, and the White House staff said, we're not interested. And it just died, before it ever got launched, and he was humiliated by it. Again, Nelson Rockefeller wasn't used to being a number two. So it's a very tricky position. It's kind of a Washington sport to watch the relationship between the president and vice president, the only two elected officials in the White House. The vice president doesn't serve at the pleasure of the president, if you will. They are, in fact, elected. So the dynamics between the two of them takes time to evolve and to develop. I think that it's far too early to tell how this relationship is going to go. It looks to me like it seemed from the beginning that one of the positive aspects of it is there is regular and routine interaction and contact. They get the intelligence briefing together pretty much every day when they're both in town. They're together at events. They're together off and on. The staff relationship is tricky. George Herbert Walker Bush in his first term and in his second term, when I was chief of staff, absolutely wanted zero competition between his staff and the president's White House staff. That's a surefire way to create controversy. And I think some of the dust up that we're seeing, unfortunately, comes from frustrated staffers who vent their frustration, whether or not the principals feel it. It is not at all unusual for a vice president to be restless, for them to have a different point of view and want to find a way to express it. But if they express it to anybody other than the president, they run a real risk of doing damage to the relationship, not rupturing it, but doing damage to it. And I think we're still in that process. You know, the speculation about what President Biden will do in terms of running for re-election is going to be there until certainly until we get past the midterm election and see how that goes. I think while he says he's going to run, he's got all the options. You know, he's got the option of not running. A vice president, no matter what they're standing in the polls, a vice president has a lot of things working for them. First of all, they have air transportation to travel around the country. I imagine we'll see Kamala Harris very active in races all across the country, raising money, and that builds support and enthusiasm among candidates state after state after state. Ironically, we probably traveled with Vice President Bush in midterm elections in 1986. Our travel schedule was as heavy as it was 2 years later in a presidential election campaign. That's because we were in fact engaged in campaigning pretty much full time, and I would anticipate you'll see Vice President Harris doing that. The other issue, and I just touch on it, is that it's this one that Nelson Rockefeller warned Bush about, and that's taking on assignments. George Herbert Walker Bush got the assignment of drug interdiction on the border. Well, you know, how's that worked out? I mean, that wasn't any easy task. He did get some criticism, but he also put together the agencies of the federal government to fight it. And so vice presidents tend to get these tough assignments that are very hard to deliver immediate and dramatic results on. That's not so unusual. It's not a sign that somehow Vice President Harris is being treated that much differently than other vice presidents. One final note. This role of vice president, I think, is very important. It's very important that the president have a partner that is trusted. Up until Walter Mondale, the vice president didn't even have a West Wing office. When they wanted to come into the White House, they had to get cleared through the gate, and they came usually off Capitol Hill where their office was. The modern day vice president it's a very different role than it's been historically, but it's still one that has to get sorted out between these two people who were elected to serve.
Al, let me switch over to you. I mean,
Craig's response was terrific, and he knows a lot more about this than I do. He's been there with a sitting vice president. I read the CNN piece, and to be honest with you, it seemed to me to be much ado about nothing. I mean, I read it and said, so what? There's always a tension between the White House staff and the VP and his or her staff. I mean, it's not unusual for a president to keep the vice president at arm's length, to not keep him, or in his case, her, fully informed. You know, Roosevelt barely talked to Truman. Truman wasn't informed about what was going on in the war. He never knew about the Manhattan Project. You know, when Roosevelt died, he was what he did with most of his time, because he didn't have anything else to do. He presided in the Senate, and he used to go down with his buddies, Dick Bowling and Speaker Rayburn, and have a drink. In the administration in which I worked, Jimmy Carter's, Vice President Mondale was the first vice president to have a West Wing office. And you should have seen the fighting among Mondale's staff to get that one little cubby hole, which was no bigger than a closet in the West Wing, so they could be with him as opposed to as opposed to being in the old executive office building where the vice president's now ceremonial office is. The Carter-Mondale thing was probably a little bit different because Carter had never been to Washington. He had no sense of how to deal with Congress. Mondale really had to play an important role, and the truth is Carter never got very good at dealing with Congress. You know, Clinton and Gore were campaign rivals. Both of them wanted to be the leader of the New South, who was going to break the losing streak in presidential elections. But in the end, when Gore ran, he didn't even want Clinton to campaign for him in 2000. And I can tell you, Bill Clinton wasn't very happy about that. To me, where Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, stands now, or even as we looked at 2024, is not our biggest problem. Democrats have a pretty big problem looking ahead to 2022 when we're in grave danger of losing control of the House for sure, and maybe the Senate. The president's approval ratings are in the toilet. NBC has the country, only 22% of the country believing we're on the right track. So the most important thing is not to worry about where the vice president stands, but worry about where the president stands.
Well,
To me, Biden's biggest challenge as we get ahead, as we look forward, is really to seize control of the presidency, to demonstrate the strength that he's on top of the country's problems, and that starts by seizing control of his party. And he's got to rein in the progressives. He's got to remind voters again why they elected him. And I hope he will do that. It will be reflected in what he finally does, or the final disposition of the reconciliation bill. But that's the challenge.
just challenging you a little bit on that. I mean, Harris's numbers are actually far worse than Joe Biden's at this point. Doesn't that worry? Isn't that a worrisome sign?
No, not for me. For one thing, in the polling I've seen, it depends where you're looking. The polling I've seen, she's a little bit below Biden, but she runs competitively with in trial heats for 2024 with people like DeSantis, Pence, Pompeo. If Biden does decide not to run, she'll launch a campaign. She'll be able to define herself on her own terms. I mean, one of the problems that Vice President Harris had when she ran for president was she never quite could figure out, in a sense, who she was. She was for Medicare for all, and then she walked it back. She was a tough prosecutor when she was attorney general, but because of a lot of pressures in the Democratic Party, she didn't want to stress that in the campaign. I hope what she's doing is sitting back and absorbing, learning a lot, learning a lot about how, she's now out of the bubble of California, which, is a very liberal state that is, Democrats aren't really pushed in California, but she's got to deal with the rest of the country. And so I hope she learns a lot. And if it happens that President Biden decides not to run, I'm sure there'll be a contest for the nomination, but I'm also sure that we'll see a Vice President Harris who is much more confident, much better prepared to run, and does a much better job of defining herself, in part because of her experience as a presidential candidate, but in part because of what she's learning sitting in the White House.
Craig, I'd like to circle back with you. And
I was thinking that Al reminds me of a very sage investment advisor who says, don't worry, stay with the market. Things go up and down. It's generally going to be up. And I think, by the way, he's right. But I'll tell you where these numbers make a difference. That they affect the staff. It is like looking at your investment account every day. And if the numbers are up, you're feeling good. And if they're down, you're feeling bad. And I think this restlessness is in no small part due to the fact that the numbers are not good. And the staff who are so dedicated to Vice President Harris don't see a path forward to quickly turn this around. My experience, Al's experience is, she's not going to turn it around by herself. It's going to get turned around when these measures are passed through Congress, as the economy improves, as COVID hopefully declines, and she's very much tied to Biden. And so she will drive her numbers up, but it's not going to be because the staff has a clever press release this week or she goes out and does 3 days of events somewhere. She actually has some very tough slogging ahead of her, as did George Herbert Walker Bush as vice president, as did Dan Quayle as vice president. And these 2022 races, she's going to be judged as how effective she is as a fundraiser and as a campaigner. And if that doesn't go well, that has consequences for both Biden and for Harris. I'll go out on a limb and get our prognostications going early. I think if it does not go well in 2022, and Biden is literally faced with working with Republican leadership in both the House and Senate, or one of the two houses, he may well decide that the best course for him is to go forward on a bipartisan basis. He's going to have great difficulty with liberal Democrats, and say, kind of do a Lyndon Johnson, that there's too many important things for me to get done to be running for office. And that would give Harris, interestingly enough, a much more freedom to go out and campaign if running for office for president is what she chooses to do. I would expect it would be, but there'll be no free ride. This will be if Biden steps aside, this would be a very hotly contested series of primaries. And it's a big if, but I do think if it doesn't go well in 2022, it'll be very hard to govern and be running for president and be 80 some years old.
I just want to ask Craig one question, because he's just alluded to it. The vice president is really defined by the president for much of the administration. But is there a point where, for example, that George Bush could separate himself from Reagan and, say, I supported all of what President Reagan did. He accomplished a lot, but now we got to go forward in this direction and define himself. Was there a point there?
So I've got a couple of stories to tell. Maybe we'll do an outtake, but I will say that one of the points came, and this, you can imagine what people were feeling when the Iran-Contra story broke. And literally, George Bush, as vice president, returned from the Oval Office, slumped into a chair and said, I'm not sure I have a shot at running, given what's just happened. And we had to recover from that fiasco, and it was a fiasco. But one of the things that was done was that George Bush was the one to go out and say mistakes were made. Now, simple as that sounds, that was a departure from what President Reagan had been saying. They totally worked it out between the two of them. President Reagan was not surprised. He understood why George Bush wanted to say it, needed to say it, but it was a point of differentiation. So it can be found, but it's very, very delicate to do.
That's exactly the difference between what happened with Gore and Clinton and Gore. Gore never quite, the impeachment was such a shadow over Gore that he never quite could, he tried to do his breaking with Clinton on policies and when Clinton had left the White House with I think a 66% approval rating because people thought he was a good president. They just didn't like his personal behavior. And he never could quite separate himself on the personal behavior without separating himself from the administration.
And Al from Craig Fuller, thank you so much. Indeed, we'll see you probably the week after Thanksgiving.
Yeah, okay.